Hello. Today we're going to be discussing Nietzsche's gay science. Now, the title of Friedrich Nietzsche's book, The Gay Science, kind of needs this clarification. Now, typically when you look into the contemporary field of discussion and rhetoric and conversation and just language in general, a lot of terms are kind of thrown around and are heavily misunderstood in what a lot of previous philosophers say about these specific terms. Gay now obviously means something referring to a specific group of people that have a specific attraction towards a specific people. Now, gay back then meant something a little bit different. Here it carries none of its contemporary connotations. Right? It refers instead to a spirit of elation, right, of passion, and this kind of liberated inquiry into something deeper. Now, an alternative translation is the joyful wisdom, and it captures this better science. It captures it in a better light regarding the science and regarding the gay. Now, the science part is interesting because similarly, it does not denote the natural sciences, but it is a more broader pursuit of knowledge and truth. Now, the title kind of signals Nietzsche's central kind of preoccupation, which is that humanity stands at a historical inflection point where it believes science can deliver things like objective truth, objective morality, right, a blueprint for how to live. And this is a confidence Nietzsche regards as dangerously naive. Now, the book is structured across 5 sections, and it has 383 morphisms, and it ranges across epistemology, morality, culture, music, metaphysics. And so it's, rather than it being some single kind of narrowed down, subject matter, or one specific inclusion, or one specific critique, one specific discussion, right? It's getting at all the different angles within philosophy, and Nietzsche's kind of outside, like his kind of insights, right, regarding this book. Now, there was a person called Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he is acknowledged in the preface as a very significant influence on Nietzsche. And that's a big fact that a lot of people that study Nietzsche don't actually recognize. They overlook it in a lot of the standard treatments of the genealogies of Nietzsche. Now, the most famous concept starts really in the book, arguably all of Nietzsche being his most famous, is the declaration that God is dead. And what Nietzsche does is he introduces it across several sections of this book, particularly in section 108. And he writes that although God is dead, his shadow will still be cast in the caves for thousands and thousands of years. And that shadow, too, must be vanquished. Now, the cave image is kind of this kind of allusion to Plato's allegory of the cave from the Republic, where the prisoners mistake shadows on a wall for reality. And obviously, Plato's kind of arguing for this theory of forms here, that these universals exist independent of our minds, right, in their own domain. And we kind of have discourse about these types of things, rather than being immanent in particulars, like Aristotle might say. Now, for Nietzsche, even after religion loses its institutional grip, the habit of ideological conviction, the human tendency to fixate on some transcendent cause, some type of system, some structure, or this belief persists biologically and psychologically. So killing God is never enough, right? The shadow of God, right? Meaning our appetite for this absolute framework, or just frameworks as a plural, must also actually be overcome. Now, the argument that he's kind of getting at, right, kind of gets really, really rigorous in section 125 of the Gay Science. And he has this famous parable of the madman in the marketplace. And you have a madman, right, and he enters carrying a lantern in broad daylight, and he's crying, "I see God, I see God." And the crowd, already composed of non-believers and people like rationalists who have moved on from religion through the Enlightenment science, they mock him. And the madman then turns on them and he says, "We have killed him. You and I, we have killed him. And all of us, right, are his murderers." And the crowd's mockery is itself a part of Nietzsche's point, that they think they have simply discarded religion cleanly, without any consequence. But the madman recognizes, what they actually don't, the death of God is not a liberation without a cost, right? He asks what happens, right, when you unchain the earth from its sun. There's no longer any up or down, no direction. There's no tethering force. And religion has a very similar effect in that type of sense because it's provided humanity with this moral center of gravity, right? It's given it a community, a structure, similar to what people like Emile Durkheim say, right? He's a functionalist and society functions like an organ, right? It gives us this stable center. And it's like a sense of purpose, right? This meaning in the cosmos. And if you was to remove it, and all of these, things become radically unstable. And as Nietzsche elaborates later on in section 343, the entire edifice of the European morality was built upon Christian theological foundations. And when the foundations collapse, so does everything built on them. The concepts of guilt and of sin and of redemption and moral obligation and the very distinction between right and wrong all require, right, this fundamental re-examination that he's trying to grow up towards. Now, Nietzsche does not present this kind of unambiguous tragedy, right? Because if you read in section 343, he also describes the death of the god as an opening, right? An open sea for the free spirits to kind of roam around. Like you have philosophers, you have atheists, you have a vast, huge horizon of lots of different possibilities in the intellectual realms. Previously foreclosed as this kind of, by this kind of ecclesiastical authority. And what he does is he implicitly refers or references figures like Galileo, who faced a lot of, danger for contradicting this kind of orthodox view of religion. And people like Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan, it was banned by the Catholic Church, who had to kind of navigate carefully around certain boundaries, even in the political philosophy in that sphere. And so the liberation is real, right? But it is inseparable from what section 124 in the Gay Science Speaks about and describes as destroying the land behind you, burning all of the bridges, right, with no possibility of return. Right? A bird escapes its cage, right, but finds itself homesick, for the land no longer exists. And so the madman, in his kind of closing remark, right, I have come too early, suggests that the full cultural and psychological consequences of God's death have not yet arrived or not been kind of understood, right? That some kind of overwhelming reckoning or perhaps a return to save some new form of ideological commitment still lies ahead. Now, later on, you get into, different things, different topics, right? You get into things more like morality and conscience, and self-knowledge and these types of things. So if you begin to take a look into section 335, what Nietzsche is doing is he's turning his critical attention to the foundations of moral judgments, right? And he opens up with the injunction, know thyself. And that's traced back to the oracle at Delphi and developed by people like Socrates. And, it argues that almost no one actually follows it, right? Our moral convictions, our sense that this is right, that is wrong, this deserves you being guilty, this deserves praise, this deserves, pain. They're not the products of rational deliberation. They're actually the accumulated sediment of personal prehistory, and they're instilled through upbringing, through cultural conditioning, through religious indoctrination and things like that. And this kind of gets into the existentialist kind of notion. Like people like Heidegger, you get thrown into the world, right? And you are kind of instilled with all of these kind of things that are around you, and you just kind of don't have a choice. Now, what passes for moral firmness is often merely stubbornness, right? An inability to absorb new ideas. And this critique, targets more broadly the Judeo-Christian moral inheritance, as well as the Enlightenment rationalist, including Immanuel Kant, whose, categorical moral imperative, right, Nietzsche regarded as simply a secularized version of the same unconditional moral commands that religion has always given to us. And against all of this, Nietzsche insists that human beings are unique and they're incomparable, and that the task is to give oneself one's own laws, to kind of create one's own values rather than to inherit them unreflectively. And this is a very interesting kind of insight, right? And this is what people get really wrong about Nietzsche. They're like, Nietzsche is a nihilist, but no, Nietzsche is not a nihilist, right? Nietzsche is an existentialist. He's one of the biggest precursors, along with Søren Kierkegaard, with his books like Fear and Trembling or like Either Or. And this is what people really don't understand about Nietzsche, is that he's an existentialist. He's wanting us to kind of demonstrate that we have to create meaning. We have to leave these things behind and kind of step up and say, yes, we've been instilled with all of these different things, but once we truly understand that, right, we begin to realize the opposing thing, which is freedom, that we can have freedom and we can create our own destinies. Now, in section 338, you have something called the critique of the pity, and it contains Nietzsche's attack on the pity, and it's a theme that he develops at a much greater length on the genealogy of morality and beyond good and evil, right? And his critique isn't to kind of simply, say that pity is kind of condescending, right? Though that is the case. But more fundamentally, pity kind of deprives its recipient of suffering. And suffering, is a necessary condition of growth and self-overcoming. And you see things like this in the Bible. For example, Romans 5, right, verses 3-5, or James 1, right, all the way through. And so the path to one's own heaven, Nietzsche writes, always leads, right, through one's own hell. And he calls this kind of compassion-driven ethics the religion of pity and the religion of, being comfortable. And he's anticipating what today might be recognized in the figure of the helicopter parent, who kind of shields his child from all adversity and thereby produces an adult incapable of resilience. And, his most kind of memorable formulation here is that happiness and unhappiness are sisters, right? They're actually even twins in a way, who either grow up together or they remain stunted together. Because one cannot truly have genuine happiness without genuine suffering, to give it meaning and to kind of contrast it from either or. Now, this kind of leads us into this idea of eternal recurrence, where you have this kind of doctrine of eternal recurrence in the sections 109, 285, and 341. And, the fullest expression of it really appears later on in the 341 section. And the eternal hourglass of existence is kind of turned upside down again and again and again, and you're with it, right? You're kind of following along with it, and everything that has happened will happen again, right? In exactly the same way, an infinite number of times. And Nietzsche presents this less as like a cosmological claim, right? But it's more of an existential kind of test, right? If you were told you would have to live your life over and over again, eternally, without it being altered, would you kind of fall into despair, or would you kind of affirm it and just say, yeah, right? It's kind of designed to be the ultimate challenge to just affirming life. Now, and what this kind of leads us into is later on, when we run into section 349, where Nietzsche is speaking about the will to power. Now, Nietzsche challenges Charles Darwin's picture of life as this kind of fundamental struggle for survival, as well as Spinoza's Conatus, right? The drive for every being to persist in its own existence. Whereas for Nietzsche, both frameworks kind of describe life from a perspective of weakness, of just bare biological preservation. But the deeper drive for him is that he's arguing that it's the will to power, right? It's a drive towards growth, right? To expand oneself, to become superior, right? To live in kind of abundance. And it's not like this crude kind of dominionship, but it's a striving that characterizes all vital, all things that are creative, right? All these things that affirm life, right? And that kind of activity. And it's standing in a direct opposition to Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy, which recommended, the denial of the will as an aesthetic withdrawal from striving. Now, this is very interesting because this, really gets us into things like work and leisure and the illusion of choice. Because if you read in the sections 329 and 356, it contains cultural criticisms that Nietzsche has of this kind of modern productive life. And what he does is he's going around diagnosing civilization, right? In, which rest kind of produces, and it produces guilt. And contemplation is always considered wasteful, right? And relentlessness, this kind of relentless chase after gain exhausts the human spirit. Now, things like virtue for him has been reduced to doing more in less time than somebody else, whereas leisure has been redefined as mere, recuperation, rest taken only in order to work again. Whereas meanwhile, individuals kind of adopt this occupational role, right, or roles as plural, that, kind of become their entire identities. And under that illusion that they can freely choose their roles, right? When in fact, actually, the environment, right, the circumstance, your inheritance, right, they largely determine them. And so as individuals for him, right, as they become more noble, kind of more mobile in a sense, in a way, right, and they kind of recognize that, and they kind of become interchangeable, partly under what Nietzsche identifies as the American influence spreading through Europe, they cease to see themselves as stones in a larger edifice, right, as certain contributors to something beyond themselves. And he kind of retreats into this radical individualism, right? And so his critique of socialism follows directly as a free society, right? And that's a contradiction in terms, right? A piece of wooden iron, right, is a phrase that he always borrows from Schopenhauer, since any functioning society requires the surrender of some individual freedom. Now, I think The Gay Science is perhaps one of Nietzsche's most panoramic books, right, because it captures the full range of his thought, and it's quite energetic in a way, going around to all these different things, bouncing back, looking at it again, and it kind of diagnoses the civilized peoples as one in a civilization, and their kind of transition from religious and then being certain about it to this kind of secular uncertainty, right? From community to individualism, from contemplation, right, to productivity. And it kind of asks whether human beings have the philosophical courage and the existential strength to face what that transition actually demands.